On February 24th, the military conflict between Russia and Ukraine enters its fifth year. Do you consider it likely to be resolved in the near future? Does Moscow consider this conflict primarily as a matter of national security or as the prevention of larger scale and inevitable clashes? As for whether we consider this conflict as a broad clash between Russia and the West, my answer is yes. Ukraine is a pawn. It is a tool that has been used by the West to build up such a foothold right on the borders of the Russian Federation in order to create threats, direct threats to our security. We know that this work was carried out immediately after Ukraine became independent. They were preparing it to join NATO, although it is well known that Ukraine's independence was recognized primarily on the basis of the Declaration of Independence, which clearly proclaimed Ukraine's policy of non-alignment with military blocs, neutrality, and renunciation of nuclear weapons. It was with this course in mind, declared by the Ukrainian leadership after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the Russian Federation, like most other countries of the world, recognized Ukraine. And when the first Maidan took place back in 2004, even then the West, first of all the Europeans, but also the Americans, of course, stood behind them in those years. And they could not keep their desires, which literally broke through in their speeches. That's when the Maidan of 2004 took place, when they demanded a third round of voting, because the protege of the West, Mr. Yushchenko, could not win. And then, I remember it perfectly well, as, in particular, the Belgian foreign minister at that time stated before the third illegal tour that Ukrainians were obliged to choose who they were with the West or with Russia, with Europe or with Russia. This mentality is either that we want to be in charge everywhere, as we commanded for more than 500 years in the colonial era, in the era of slavery. We also want to continue living at the expense of others in the neo-colonial period, and, among other things, create all kinds of threats to our competitors. And, of course, they viewed Russia as a competitor on the world stage. They hoped that Russia would also fall apart after the Soviet Union. We know a lot of such facts. President Putin has repeatedly said this. So it was a battle that was prepared in advance, which was funded in advance, including it was also funded by the Americans. Most recently, while already outside the State Department, Victoria Nuland, the architect of Ukrainian politics, admitted that they had spent $5 billion on preparing Ukraine for a coup and turning it into an anti-Russia. It's all in the public domain, so it's clear that this is not about any accidents, feuds between two neighboring nations. This is about a geopolitical project that the West has repeatedly developed over the long centuries of history in order to weaken and destroy our country. Well, you see, Napoleon gathered the vast majority of European countries not under the banner of Nazism, but under the banner of the greatness of France. It's such an imperial approach. It's definitely an approach. That meant that very colonial mindset. I do what I want to do. Now signs of this approach are also making their way in the international arena. They didn't succeed. The Russians were in the French capital, where they demanded to be served quickly, and therefore the name of such cafes bistros appeared. Then the Russians were in Berlin, when Hitler again gathered almost the whole of Europe under his banner, including many of our current neighbors, geographical neighbors, who, after the end of the Cold War period, tried in every possible way to whitewash their role in the genocide of the Soviet people, the peoples of the Soviet Union. But Hitler has already openly rallied all his subordinate peoples under the Nazi banner. And the Zelensky regime is largely a repetition of history, but not as a farce, because too many people have died for farce, which Zelensky sacrifices, which are sacrificed by his Western patrons and masters. But this is a regime that adopted Nazi laws, a regime that destroyed all monuments, that somehow remind us of our joint victory in the Great Patriotic War. This is a regime that glorifies Bandera, Shukovich, and other collaborators convicted by the Nuremberg Tribunal, and encourages the ideology and practice of Nazism. Of course, this reflects, as we are now finding out in practice, reflects the true intentions of the West, which have not disappeared anywhere, which mean only one thing, that the West is ready to resort to these Nazi misanthropic methods again, spreading hatred towards all Russians, so that Russia does not feel safe. Therefore, of course, the answer is that this is a global conflict. In terms of the nature of this conflict, how do you view the agreement on security guarantees that are being discussed between the United States and Ukraine? Did the last meeting of the American delegation with Mr. President Putin bring concrete results? Judging by the current situation, how realistic do you see the coming of peace? I won't talk about the security guarantee agreement between the United States and Ukraine, because we haven't seen it. And it is not in our tradition to disclose the content of meetings that we hold within the diplomatic framework, especially on serious issues of conflict resolution. But the agreement that Zelensky, his minister Sybiga, and a number of other Ukrainian figures are now talking about on every corner, the agreement with the United States, we have not seen it. Although, I repeat, they are already in violation of all the laws of diplomatic ethics. Following their teachers like Macron and others who want to constantly disclose some information without incurring any responsibility for it. We don't have such habits, and we believe that everyone should take negotiations seriously. When I hear that Zelensky said that they have a 100% security agreement with the United States, and they will not cede any part of their land, and they still need to decide how to return the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant to them. I just have such an unusual feeling that it's a winner performs. Moreover, not just the winner on the battlefield in Donbass, in Novorossiya, but the winner of the whole of Europe during its confrontation with the United States, which began under President Trump. Because of Europe's attempts to force Trump to follow the policy of his sworn opponent, Biden, Europe has clearly not only overestimated its strength, it has not even been able to observe decency here. It has failed to respect the policies that the new U.S. president has begun to pursue on the world stage. And Zelensky accused Europe of being too soft on Trump. It needs to be tougher. It needs to involve the United States in more active support for the war. It was in Davos. Therefore, we do not know about security guarantees, but we know in this regard, first of all, the question of what will happen next. What will happen after the end of this conflict? We have said many times, and the president has reminded us of this very often, that the truce that Zelensky is seeking again, at least for 60 days, and preferably longer, is unacceptable to us. Because all previous periods related to our diplomatic efforts during this special military operation ended with the fact that any truce was immediately used by them to pump Ukraine with new weapons in order to give this regime a break. In order to catch as many people as possible on the streets of Ukrainian cities, in order to push them to the front line as cannon fodder, and in general, to get rest and gain strength to continue the war against Russia. And now all the talks are about security guarantees, which the Ukrainian leaders, the Europeans, Ruda, and the ministers of many NATO and European Union member states are so proud of. They claim that guaranteeing security will be the key to not resuming this conflict, but it will be the key to a completely different door. Because if you look at what they are talking about, Then these masters of the Zelensky regime are working to guarantee the security of this illegal, illegitimate regime, whose roots, as we all know, were launched in February 2014 during the coup. And now the continuers of this regime still rule in Ukraine. They are still henchmen of the West for the constant irritation of the Russian Federation, to create threats to our security. And, this is interesting. By the way, I discussed this topic with my Turkish friends a long time ago. And when I had such sporadic contacts on the sidelines of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe with some Western colleagues, they all talked about security guarantees. We formulated honest security guarantees in Istanbul in April 2022. This was the result, in my opinion, of 3 rounds of negotiations already well organized by our Turkish friends. Moreover, these were negotiations that the Ukrainian side requested shortly after the start of our special military operation. As you know, we started these negotiations in Belarus, and then we moved to the beautiful city of Istanbul, where several rounds took place. And these rounds ended with the fact that, at the initiative of Ukraine, the principles of settlement were agreed upon. There were also security guarantees. Security guarantees were provided there for both Russia and Ukraine, and in general, for this entire geopolitical territory. These were European guarantees. And these guarantees were provided by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, including not only the United States, France, Britain, but also China and Russia. Plus, it was proposed that Germany and Turkey join these guarantor countries. And it wasn't our format. That was approved. This format was proposed by Ukrainians. And it clearly stated what these security guarantees mean. This is the absence of foreign military bases on the territory of Ukraine. No military exercises involving foreigners, unless such military exercises are approved by all the guarantor countries. Everything was very detailed and specific there. And if someone violates these guarantees, the guarantor countries take measures to curb these violations. And these measures were spelled out quite in the spirit of the 5th article of the Washington Treaty of the North Atlantic Alliance. Well, you know about this. We agreed, and President Putin and President Erdogan have discussed this more than once. But then some Boris Johnson arrived in Kyiv and forbade them to sign this document, which had already been initialed. And on its basis, we had to develop a detailed agreement. The head of the Ukrainian delegation to those Istanbul talks, David Arahamia, the head of the presidential faction in the Verkhovna Rada, spoke about this openly and repeatedly in an interview. He said everything was ready, but Boris Johnson said no. By the way, among other things, this also reflects the degree of independence of the Ukrainian regime, as well as the degree of adequacy of those people who led at that time, and who now continue to lead the former colonial powers. It is very difficult to get rid of the habits of leading by all and everyone. Therefore, these are the security guarantees that will strengthen a regime that has lost its legitimacy. This is a regime that is the only one in the world that has abolished the language of an entire nation, which has banned the canonical Orthodox Church, which, excuse me for another appeal to Turkish realities, has become just a pawn in the hands of the West, and a pawn in the hands of the Patriarch of Constantinople, who has set a course for the collapse of Orthodoxy. We know that it started with the support of the Biden administration. And now we don't see any attempts from the West to stop interfering in the affairs of the Church. I'll tell you a secret. I hope that no one will take offense at me for this. When we were in Alaska, when Presidents Putin and Trump sat down at the negotiating table, the topic of conversation turned to the rights of Russians, which were totally banned in Ukraine. And President Putin mentioned that not only is the Russian language banned there, but they have also banned the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. President Trump did not believe this, and he asked Marco Rubio several times whether such laws had actually been adopted in Ukraine. Therefore, the issue of security directly concerns the essence of the regime. It directly concerns those absolutely unacceptable and disgusting statements that Zelensky makes. The other day, he called for killing 50,000 Russians, killing and disabling them. Only such a figure will ensure their victory. Well, the inadequacy of this man is visible to everyone. And I would like to point out that so far the Ukrainian constitution contains a requirement that no one has abolished. This is a requirement for the Ukrainian state to ensure the rights of all national minorities, linguistic and other rights. Not to mention that the UN Charter requires everyone to respect human rights, regardless of race, gender, language, or religion. I started talking about our Turkish colleagues. We asked some Westerners, as well as some of our BRICS partners, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, questions. You are calling for peace in Ukraine, and you have contacts with Ukrainians. Some of the countries of Central Asia and Transcaucasia periodically send humanitarian aid to the Kiev regime. They have contacts. They visit each other. They send delegations. And we ask them, when you communicate with them, when you call them to peace, to find an approach acceptable to all, do you mention these topics concerning linguistic and religious human rights? Well, I can't imagine another situation like this. They can't answer us. And, unfortunately, it seems that hardly anyone besides us poses these questions to the Ukrainian regime. Again, the exception is the Trump administration, which, after several months of getting up to speed, prepared a 28-item plan that clearly stated the requirement to restore the rights of national minorities, linguistic rights, religious rights, and so on. We have not seen the document that Zelensky constantly calls the 20-item plan, which, as we understand it, the Ukrainians and the Europeans have redone, compared with the original plan of the United States. And now they are trying to sell their vision of this peace to the American administration. We have not yet seen it in its entirety, but those interim versions of the plan no longer contain requirements to ensure and respect the rights of national minorities. It only says that the parties should show tolerance and be guided by the norms of the European Union. Why should they? We know the norms of the European Union regarding human rights and humanitarian issues. They absolutely do not correspond to our vision. On the contrary, they contradict traditional values, including the values of great world religions such as Orthodoxy and Islam. And we don't understand how they want to change all this now. Once again, the European Union is trying to interfere with the seemingly emerging positive processes in order to reverse these positive processes. So that's my answer about security guarantees.